The night Renata Voss signed her name on a single sheet of paper and became the legal owner of a crumbling warehouse on the edge of an industrial ghost town, she had exactly $43 in a zippered pouch tucked inside her coat, a 7-year-old daughter asleep against her shoulder, and nowhere to go before morning. The lawyer who handed her the document was a thin man named Gerald Pruitt, and he had clearly not expected this meeting to last long. He had scheduled it for 4 in the afternoon, during the dead hour when his secretary took her coffee break and the phones went quiet. He had prepared a single manila folder, a pen, and a rehearsed explanation delivered with the careful neutrality of someone who did not want to be asked follow-up questions. He told Renata that a man named Elias Voss, her father's older brother, a man she had met exactly twice in her life, had died 4 months prior at the age of 81. He told her that the estate was modest, that the property in question was a warehouse in Caldwell Junction, a former manufacturing district about 90 miles northeast of the city, that it had been assessed at a value of $1, a symbolic figure assigned by the county when properties fall below a certain threshold of structural and market viability, that all other assets from the estate, if any existed, had already been settled, that she was, to Mr. Pruitt's visible bewilderment, the sole beneficiary. Renata had not said much during this explanation. She had sat very straight in the wooden chair across from his desk, her daughter Mira pressed into her side, and she had listened to every word. When he finished and slid the folder toward her, she had asked only one question. She had asked whether the property came with any liens, any outstanding debts, any claims she would be responsible for. Gerald Pruitt had blinked, clearly not expecting that question from a woman in a coat that had seen too many winters, and he had checked his folder and confirmed that the property was debt-free, fully transferred, hers without condition. She had nodded slowly. Then she had signed. She signed because $43 was not enough for a deposit on anything, and because the shelter on Meridian Avenue had told her last week that their family rooms were full until at least the end of the month, and because Mira had started waking up in the night grabbing for her, frightened by sounds and shadows and the instability of sleeping in different places, and because Renata had run out of alternatives the way water runs out in drought. Gradually, and then all at once, the warehouse was hers. It was worth $1. She didn't know what she would do with it, but she was going to find out. The story of how Renata Voss ended up sitting in a law office, signing over a worthless building, the story of the years that led to that chair, that pen, that manila folder, is not a short one. But it is important to understand, because everything that happened afterward only makes sense in the context of everything that came before. Renata had grown up in the eastern part of the city in a neighborhood called Faro Hill, which had once been a working-class enclave of modest dignity, and had slowly, through the 80s and 90s, become something harder and less forgiving. Her parents, Thomas and Celeste Voss, were not wealthy people, but they were steady people, the kind who paid their bills on time and kept their front steps swept, and believed that if you worked honestly and asked for nothing you weren't owed, you would come out all right in the end. Thomas worked 31 years for a municipal water utility, fixing pipes and monitoring treatment systems. Celeste worked part-time as a bookkeeper for 3 different small businesses on the same street. They were not close to Thomas's older brother Elias, who had left Faro Hill at 25 and rarely looked back, and the subject of why was one of those family silences Renata had learned not to press on. She had been a quiet, observant child, the kind who watched more than she spoke and remembered everything she saw. She had done well in school, not brilliantly but solidly, and she had developed an early and lasting love of construction, of how things were built, how structures held together, how a foundation determined everything that sat on top of it. She had wanted to study architectural engineering, had been accepted to a state program, and had started her first year with the particular mixture of terror and exhilaration that comes from being the first person in your immediate family to attend university. She had been 20 years old and full of a careful, disciplined hope. Then her mother had gotten sick. Elias Voss was diagnosed with an aggressive form of pancreatic cancer the November of Renata's second semester, and the treatment was immediate and expensive and consuming. Thomas tried to manage it alone. Art insisted Renata stay in school, told her on every phone call that everything was fine, that she should focus, that her mother would want her to focus. But Renata had gone home for Christmas and seen the hollowness in her father's face and the stack of medical bills on the kitchen table, and understood that fine was not an accurate description of the situation. She had gone back for the spring semester. She had taken her exams. And when summer came, she did not return for her second year. She told herself it was temporary. She told herself she would go back. She never did. Her mother died 14 months after the diagnosis. Her father, who had been a steady man for 31 years, became a man who sat very still in rooms. Renata worked 2 jobs and kept the household running, and watched her father slowly drift back toward something resembling function. She met a man named Daniel Okafor at the warehouse supply company, where she worked inventory shifts, and he was warm and funny and had a way of making the world feel less heavy. They were married when Renata was 26. When she was 29, Mira was born, and the weight of everything Renata had given up rearranged itself into something that felt, for a while, like purpose. It did not last. Daniel was not a dishonest person, but he was an unlucky one, and his unluckiness had a specific shape. He believed consistently and sincerely in things that did not pan out. A business venture with a college friend that collapsed after 18 months. A real estate investment that he was certain was solid, and turned out to have been misrepresented in ways a lawyer later confirmed were actionable, but not worth pursuing. A period of freelance consulting work that kept promising to stabilize and never did. Renata did not stop loving him through any of this, but the resources eroded. The apartment they had been proud of became unmanageable. They moved to a smaller one, and then a cheaper one. Arguments that had once been disagreements became something colder and more habitual. When Mira was 5, Daniel told Renata that he had accepted a job offer in a different city, that he needed to try something fresh, that he wanted her and Mira to come with him, and that he understood if she felt she couldn't. She felt she couldn't. He left. He sent money when he was able to, which was not consistently. For 2 years, Renata had managed, and she had worked as a site coordinator for a small renovation company, which paid adequately and used the knowledge she had accumulated from a half-finished engineering degree and years of practical observation. She had kept them in their apartment. She had kept Mira in her school. She had not asked for help because asking for help felt, in the particular emotional economy of her life, like a kind of surrender she was not ready to make. Then the renovation company lost its 2 largest contracts in the same quarter, and her position was eliminated, and the timing coincided with a rent increase at their building, and the sequence of events that followed was the kind that doesn't feel catastrophic when it's happening, because each individual step seems small enough to survive, until you look up and realize you've walked off the edge of something. The $43 in the zippered pouch represented the remainder of what she had been able to save from her last paycheck after paying for a week at a budget motel while she waited for this appointment with Gerald Pruitt. She had received the letter about the inheritance 6 weeks prior, forwarded through 3 addresses. She had not allowed herself to feel hopeful about it, because the words, assessed value $1, were right there in the second paragraph, and she had enough experience with the gap between expectation and reality to know better. But she had made the appointment. She had brought Mira, who had fallen asleep before they reached the lawyer's office and was still sleeping now. leaning against Renata in the back of a bus headed northeast out of the city, toward a place called Caldwell Junction, a place Renata had never been, carrying a single key on a plain metal ring. Mira woke somewhere around the halfway point and looked up at her mother with the temporarily disoriented expression of children coming back from sleep. She rubbed her eyes. She looked at the dark window, at the passing lights of the highway, at the unfamiliar shapes of the landscape. Then she looked at Renata. "Mama," she said, "where are we going?" "To a place we own," Renata said. Mira was quiet for a moment, turning this over. "A house?" "A building. A big one." "What kind of building?" "A warehouse. It's where people used to store things." Mira thought about this seriously, the way she thought about everything. She had her father's eyes and Renata's habits of silence, and she was the kind of 7-year-old who would rather understand something fully than ask questions carelessly. "Are we going to live there?" she asked. Renata looked at her daughter in the dark of the bus. She thought about the $43. She thought about the key on the plain metal ring. "For now," she said. "Yes." "Is it safe?" "I don't know yet," Renata said. "But I'm going to find out before we go inside." Mira leaned back against her mother and didn't say anything else. She was not a child who needed to be reassured with false certainty. She was a child who trusted that her mother told her the truth, and the truth for now was sufficient. Caldwell Junction at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night was not a cheerful place. The bus let them off at a junction of 2 state roads, where a gas station and a closed diner represented most of what the town had to offer at street level. The gas station attendant, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a skeptical expression, gave Renata directions to the Voss warehouse property when she showed him the address on the documents from Pruitt's folder. He looked at her, and at Mira, and at the address, and back at her. "You the new owner?" he said. "Yes," Renata said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "Good luck with that," he said. He said it without cruelty, but also without much warmth, the way you might say it to someone you'd just watched buy a lottery ticket. The warehouse was a 15-minute walk from the gas station, down a road that transitioned from pavement to cracked concrete, to something that was technically still a road, but felt like the road had lost interest in the idea. The night was cold and clear, so with a nearly full moon that provided enough light to see by, which was fortunate, because the streetlights along the road were either broken or never installed. Mira walked beside her mother without complaint, her small hand in Renata's, looking at everything. The building emerged from the darkness gradually, the way large things do at night, first as a mass, a heaviness on the horizon, a shape that took up too much space to be anything small. Then, as they got closer, the details resolved. The long flat roofline, the corrugated metal walls stained with rust and weather, the tall loading bay doors along the front face, padlocked and still. A chain-link fence surrounded the perimeter, interrupted on the south side by a gate that corresponded to the key in Renata's pocket. She stood at the gate and looked at the building for a long moment. It was in worse condition than she had imagined, and better condition than she had feared, which was approximately what she had expected, given Gerald Pruitt's assessed at $1 framing. The walls were intact, no visible collapse, no sections that had caved or buckled, though the rust on the metal cladding was extensive, and the roof showed several areas of sag that would need inspection. Windows along the upper story, a row of industrial panes set into the concrete block sections between metal panels, were mostly intact, 3 or 4 broken, but not suggesting systemic failure. The loading bay doors looked solid. Whatever the building's current problems, structural catastrophe was not immediately evident. Renata opened the gate. It swung on hinges that shrieked with rust, but held. She took her daughter's hand again and walked toward the building. "Mama," Mira said quietly. Yeah, I'm scared. Renata squeezed her hand. Me too, she said. A little. That's okay. So we're just going to look. She used the flashlight on her phone to check the ground around the main personnel door on the south face, scanning for any signs of hazard. The concrete pad was cracked, but stable. No standing water, no obvious sinkholes, no fallen material. The door itself was a heavy steel fire door, padlocked with a lock that matched the key. She tried it. The lock opened on the third attempt, stiff from disuse. The door swung outward. The smell that came from inside was a dense accumulation of time. Metal, dust, something organic and dry that might have been old wood. And underneath all of it, a faint industrial undertone, the ghost of whatever had once been manufactured or stored here. Renata stood at the threshold and shone her flashlight into the interior. The space was enormous. The beam of her phone's light barely reached the far wall. The warehouse floor was concrete, cracked in several places, and covered in a layer of dust and detritus. Fallen ceiling material, old pallets, stacked along one wall, scattered debris of indeterminate age. Metal shelving units ran along sections of the walls, some of them empty, some still holding boxes and containers too far away to identify. A system of overhead support beams ran the length of the space at approximately 12 feet, below the actual ceiling, which was another 6 to 8 feet above that. Renata scanned left and right, checking the ceiling, checking the walls, checking the floor immediately in front of them. It's huge, Mira whispered. Yeah, Renata said. It really is. She stepped inside carefully, keeping to the right along the wall, where the concrete looked most stable, testing each step before committing to it. The floor held. She walked 10 feet, 20, shining the light in every direction. The building had a solidity to it that the exterior rust had not suggested. The concrete block walls were thick, the structural columns were properly spaced and showed no visible cracking. The overhead beams were steel and appeared sound. This was a building that had been built seriously by someone who intended it to last. She found a breaker panel on the interior south wall next to the door. Old, but present. She opened it and examined the configuration with her flashlight. It was a standard industrial setup, main breaker in the off position. She looked for any signs of water damage or fire damage around the panel. Nothing alarming. She considered for a moment. Then she reached up and switched the main breaker on. Nothing happened for 2 seconds. Then, deep in the building, something hummed. Then overhead, one by one, a series of industrial fluorescent lights flickered and stuttered and began, improbably, to glow. Not all of them, perhaps a third of them, unevenly distributed across the space, but enough. The warehouse came into dim, cold, functional light. Mira made a sound of surprised delight. "The lights work," she said. "The lights work," Renata agreed. The electricity was on. That meant the service had either never been terminated or had been maintained. Neither explanation seemed immediately obvious, but Renata noted it and moved on. She walked the perimeter of the main floor slowly and thoroughly, the way she had learned to walk construction sites, looking at what was there, what was missing, what was wrong, and what was surprisingly right. She was cataloging, as she always did, because cataloging was the first step toward understanding, and understanding was the first step toward any kind of plan. The main floor was approximately 200 feet long by 120 feet wide. She estimated that from her count of column spacings, on the characteristic 20-foot industrial bay intervals, at one end, the north end, there was a raised office section, a concrete block enclosure about 30 feet wide, and the full width of the building, perhaps 20 feet high, with windows overlooking the floor. Stairs on either side led up to it. This was the administrative area, standard for industrial buildings of this type and era. A loading dock occupied the east face, with 3 interior bay positions where trucks would have backed in. The west wall had 2 additional large doors for forklift access, both padlocked from the inside. She climbed the stairs to the office level and pushed open the door. 4 offices, connected by a central corridor. Metal desks still in 2 of them, filing cabinets in a third, a break room with a counter and a sink at the end. She turned on the faucet in the break room out of curiosity. The water ran brown for 10 seconds, then cleared. Pipes were intact. She turned it off. She stood in the doorway of the largest office and looked out through the interior windows at the warehouse floor below, at the cone of light from the working fluorescents, at the shadows and the dust and the old pallets, at Mira, who was walking slowly in a small, careful circle in the center of the floor, looking up at the ceiling with her arms slightly extended, a gesture that meant she was taking in the scale of something. Aunt Renata thought, "It needs work. It needs a lot of work. There are things here that have to be addressed before this is a safe, livable space in any conventional sense. The heating situation was unknown. The plumbing needed to be run for any actual use. The broken windows needed to be dealt with. And a thorough inspection of the roof was going to be essential before she could assess what the water infiltration situation was. But the bones were good. The bones were very good. She had looked at enough buildings in her years of site work to know the difference between a building that could be saved and a building that was already dying from the inside. This one was not dying. This one had been neglected. Yes, left alone and uncared for. Ignored and underestimated. The way things are when no one is paying attention and no one considers them worth the effort. But neglect and ruin were different things, and Renata had learned that difference in a specific, hard-won way. She went back downstairs. Mira was still standing in the center of the floor, looking up. "What are you looking at?" Renata asked. "The ceiling," Mira said. "It's really high. About 20 feet. How do you know?" "I count the columns and measure the spacing and do the math in my head." Mira looked at her. "Can I learn to do that?" "Yes," Renata said. "I'll teach you." She looked at her watch. It was nearly 11. She looked around the space for a place to sleep, and she found it in the most sheltered corner between the north office wall and the east loading dock section, where a stack of old wooden pallets could be rearranged into something flat enough to put their jackets on. She did this practically and without sentiment, because practicality was the only approach that was going to work right now, and she had learned a long time ago that practicality and dignity were not incompatible. She had 2 jackets and the small backpack that held their essential things. She had water in a bottle. She had most of the crackers from a sleeve she'd bought at the gas station. She made them a space. They ate. Mira asked questions for a while, about the building, about who had built it, about what Elias Voss had been like, about whether they would stay here for a long time. And Renata answered each one honestly, which mostly meant saying that she didn't know yet, but she was going to find out. Mira seemed satisfied with this. She fell asleep within 15 minutes of lying down, which was one of the mercies of childhood, this ability to find rest in the middle of uncertainty. Renata stayed awake longer. She lay on her back looking up at the distant ceiling, at the dark industrial rafters, at the few working fluorescents she had switched off except for one at the far end of the building, which she had left on because complete darkness in an unfamiliar space was a variable she didn't want to add to the existing list of variables. She thought about the warehouse. She thought about its size, its structure, its apparent soundness. She thought about why a $1 assessed warehouse would have active electricity and functional plumbing. She thought about Elias Voss, who she had met twice, once at a family gathering when she was 11, and once very briefly at her mother's funeral. and who she had understood to be a man who had left his family's world and built something separate, something private, something no one in the family had ever been invited to see. She thought about the fact that in whatever arrangements he had made before he died, he had chosen her, not his own children if he had them, and Gerald Pruitt had not mentioned any. Not any person more closely connected to him, more familiar, more present in his life. He had chosen Renata, a woman he barely knew, for reasons she did not have. She turned this over in her mind for a long time, the way you turn an unusual stone in your hand, feeling for something that tells you what it is. In the morning, she would start properly. She would do a full structural walkthrough, taking notes on her phone. She would figure out the heating situation. She would look through the filing cabinets in the office for any documents that might tell her more about the building's history, about Elias Voss, about what had happened here. She would assess what needed to be done, and in what order, and with what resources. And she would begin. She was not naive enough to think the warehouse was going to transform their lives. $1 was $1. A crumbling industrial building in a ghost town was a crumbling industrial building in a ghost town, whatever its structural merits. But she had spent the last 2 years watching herself lose things, watching options close, watching the space she had to maneuver in grow smaller and smaller, and she was not willing to watch any longer. Something in her had shifted in that lawyer's office, some quiet internal mechanism that had been straining under the weight of passivity and waiting. She had something now that was hers, even if it was worth almost nothing. She could work with something that was hers. She closed her eyes. She slept. The first full day at the warehouse began at 6:30, when the eastern windows let in the earliest light, and the cold woke Renata completely before any amount of resolve could have. She checked on Mira, who was curled tightly under both their jackets and still sleeping, then stood and stretched and began her first real assessment of the space. In daylight, the warehouse revealed itself differently. Overnight, it had been a dim and shadowed thing, mysterious in its scale, speaking in the language of echoes and industrial silences. In morning light, filtering through the upper windows and the broken panes she had noted the night before, it became a concrete thing, a thing with specifics and problems and details. The daylight was more honest and less forgiving, which was what she needed. She walked the perimeter of the main floor first, slowly, methodically, her phone out and taking notes. And she was looking for 5 categories of concern: foundation issues, wall integrity, roof leaks and water damage, structural member condition, and environmental hazards. The last category covering anything from asbestos, this building was old enough to be a concern, to fuel contamination, to mold accumulation in areas of standing water infiltration. The foundation, as far as she could assess without digging or major investigation, appeared sound. The concrete floor showed cracking consistent with normal thermal cycling over decades. No significant heaving, no differential settlement patterns that would indicate undermining or soil failure. The walls were poured concrete block and showed no structural cracking, though there was evidence of efflorescence in several places, the white mineral deposits that indicate water moving through concrete, which would need to be addressed but was not immediately dangerous. The roof was more complicated. From the inside, she could see 3 distinct areas of staining on the concrete below the sagging sections she had identified from outside, which confirmed water infiltration. None of the staining appeared recent. The discoloration was old and dried, suggesting the leaks had been present for years, but were not actively worsening, possibly because the building had been essentially unused and unmaintained, but not subjected to any recent major weather events. And she noted the locations precisely. The structural steel, the overhead beams, the column caps, the connections, was in better condition than she had expected, showing surface rust, but no significant cross-section loss. Someone had applied a protective coating to these elements at some point in the building's history, and while that coating had worn in places, it had done its job. What she did not find, on this first walkthrough, was asbestos, or rather, she found no friable material, no pipe insulation that might contain it, no floor tiles of the suspicious vintage and composition. This was not a guarantee, but it was a positive sign. The building appeared to have been stripped of most of its interior mechanical systems at some point, leaving clean concrete and metal where there might otherwise have been complicated legacy materials. She was halfway through her second pass when she noticed the door. It was on the west wall, near the north end, partially obscured by a section of heavy steel shelving that she had moved along in her first pass without examining closely. The shelving unit was bolted to the wall and partially blocking what she had initially cataloged as a segment of solid wall. But moving around to the back of the shelving unit, she could see it clearly. A door, set into the concrete block wall, the same heavy steel fire door construction as the main entrance. Padlocked. Different key from the one she had used to enter. She had not seen it on her first walk, because the shelving unit was positioned specifically to make it invisible from the main floor. You had to go to the back of the unit, into the narrow space between the shelving and the wall, to see it at all. If you were doing a casual walkthrough, even a reasonably careful one, you would miss it. Renata had only found it because she had been doing a systematic perimeter check, running her hand along the walls at intervals to feel for inconsistencies in the wall plane. She stood in the narrow space between the shelving unit and the wall and looked at the door for a long moment. It was a door. That was all. Buildings had interior doors. It was not remarkable. What was slightly remarkable was the shelving unit in front of it, which was not positioned carelessly or randomly. The unit's placement relative to the door was precise, intentional, and someone had put it there to cover the door, and the padlock on this door was different in character from the others she had encountered. It was heavier, newer, and she noticed now, cleaner. The other padlocks in the building showed the same rust and disuse as everything else. This one was dusty but not corroded. It was a different age from the door it was securing. Someone had updated this lock. Not recently, but more recently than the others. Renata did not touch it. She stepped back out from behind the shelving unit and stood on the main floor and thought about this. She thought about Gerald Pruitt and his manila folder. She thought about a man named Elias Voss who had left his family and built something private. She thought about a building assessed at $1 with active electrical service, sound structure, and a door behind a shelving unit with a newer lock. She went back to the office level and began, methodically, to go through the filing cabinets. The first two cabinets were empty, which she had half expected. The third was locked, standard file cabinet lock, which yielded in under 2 minutes to a straightened wire clip she found on the floor of the break room, a trick she had learned from a site manager who had said that file cabinet locks were decorative suggestions, not actual security. Inside were 3 file folders. She brought them to the desk by the window, where the light was best, and opened the first one. Building permits. For this building, going back to 1961, when it was constructed. Then a series of modification permits from 1974, 1988, and one that stopped her, 2003. The 2003 modification permit was for an interior structural modification, listed as storage room addition, reinforced construction, west wall integration. The permit had been properly filed with Caldwell County and bore the signature of the building inspector and the applicant. The applicant's name was Elias J. Voss. Renata set this down and opened the second folder. Insurance documents, commercial property insurance, paid up through a renewal date of 14 months prior, which was approximately when Elias Voss would have begun declining seriously enough that administration of his affairs would have lapsed. The coverage was standard commercial property coverage, No unusual riders or endorsements, but the coverage amount was notable. $2 million for a building assessed at $1. And she sat very still for a moment. She opened the third folder. It was thinner than the others, containing only 3 documents. The first was a handwritten letter, 2 pages, in the careful block script of an older person. It was addressed to no one specifically, which meant it was addressed to whoever was reading it. Renata read it slowly, twice. The letter said that the writer had spent the better part of his adult life engaged in a series of activities that had proven more fruitful than he had any right to expect. It said that he had not been a man inclined toward family, had not been capable of the closeness that family required, but that this had not meant he was indifferent to the question of legacy. It said that he had made provisions. It said that whoever was reading this letter had been chosen not randomly, but deliberately, that the choice had been made on the basis of qualities observed over years from a distance, qualities that included a kind of practical intelligence and a willingness to work and a specific hardness that came from loss, which he described as the only education that actually sticks. It said that what the building contained was not obvious and would not be found without effort. It said that the effort was the point. It said that the only additional guidance he was willing to provide was that the keys to the things he had left behind were, in most cases, in the building itself. The second document was a notarized copy of the property deed, confirming the transfer already completed through Gerald Pruitt's office. The third document was a photograph, old, printed on glossy paper, in the way photographs from the 90s were printed. It showed the interior of the warehouse, taken from somewhere on the main floor looking toward the north wall. In the photograph, the shelving units were not present. The west wall was clearly visible. And there, where Renata had found the door, the photograph showed not just a door, but the wall around it. And on the wall around it, faintly visible in the photograph's slightly overexposed light, were markings she couldn't quite make out, symbols or letters or measurements of some kind, applied directly to the concrete. And the markings were not there now. She knew because she had run her hand along that wall. The wall had been painted at some point after this photograph was taken, a coat of industrial gray that had smoothed over whatever had been written there. She put the photograph down and looked out the window at the warehouse floor below, at the morning light, at Mira, who had woken while Renata was reading and was now sitting cross-legged on the main floor, eating crackers and looking at her own hands with the remote expression she got when she was thinking about something complex. "Mama," Mira called up, not looking. "What are you reading?" "Letters," Renata said, "from the man who used to own this place." "What did he say?" "He said the things he left behind are hidden, and that finding them was the point." Mira looked up at her then, eyed through the interior window, with those clear eyes that saw things straight. "Like a treasure hunt?" she said. "Maybe," Renata said, "like a treasure hunt." She came down from the office level and stood in front of the shelving unit that blocked the door. She had no key for the newer lock. She had no tools beyond what was in her backpack. A multi-tool, a small pry bar she carried out of old professional habit, her phone. She looked at the shelving unit. She looked at the floor beneath it, at the scuff marks in the dust that indicated the unit could be moved, had been moved, even though it was bolted to the wall at the top. The bolts at the top were fastened to a wall bracket. The unit itself was freestanding except for that connection. She examined the bracket. Standard lag bolts, the kind that required a socket wrench to remove. She did not have a socket wrench. She added it to the list on her phone. She added, "Hardware store. Find what's accessible in Caldwell Junction." She added, "Keys. Look for them in the building, per the letter." She added, "West wall door, reinforced storage room, 2003 permit." she added. $2 million insurance on a $1 building. She stood in the middle of the warehouse floor and let the full weight of what she was beginning to understand settle into her slowly. The way understanding always settled when you had enough pieces, but not enough of them yet. A feeling not of clarity, but of the shadow of clarity. The outline of a shape you couldn't yet see directly. Mira came to stand beside her. She put her hand in Renata's. She looked at the shelving unit, at the west wall behind it. "What's behind there?" she asked. "A door," Renata said. "And behind the door, a room. And I don't know what's in the room yet." "Are you going to find out?" "Yes," Renata said. She squeezed her daughter's hand. "We're going to find out." The town of Caldwell Junction had not always been a ghost. There was a period, roughly 1945 to 1978, during which it had been something resembling alive. The industrial district along the northeast edge of town, where Renata's warehouse sat, had in its time housed a cluster of small manufacturers, the kind of mid-century American industry that tooled metal and pressed rubber and fabricated components for larger industries in larger places. The Voss building, constructed in 1961, had been one of the last to go up in that cluster. And given its size and the quality of its construction, it had clearly been built by someone with resources and ambition and a horizon longer than the average. Renata learned this at the Caldwell Junction Public Library, which was open 3 days a week and staffed by a woman named Harriet, who had been born in town, had left for college, and had come back after 40 years, working in archival research at a university, which meant she knew exactly where every historical record in the building was, and was quietly and completely delighted to help someone actually use them. She had left Mira at the warehouse, a decision she had made carefully, having assessed the building's hazards methodically enough to identify a safe zone, having left her daughter with explicit and detailed instructions and the phone with a charged battery, and walked the 20 minutes into the center of town. A Caldwell Junction in daylight was not much more encouraging than it had been at night, but it had a certain spare dignity, the kind that belonged to places that had accepted their diminishment without pretending otherwise. Harriet spread county records across a reading table and talked Renata through them with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting years for a genuinely interesting research question. The Voss warehouse had been constructed by an Elias Voss, who had arrived in Caldwell County in 1959 at the age of 34, with no particular history visible in local records, had purchased the land outright for cash, and had contracted with a regional construction firm to build the warehouse in 1960 and 1961. He had listed his occupation in various documents as independent trader, and later as commodity broker, descriptions vague enough to encompass almost anything. He had not integrated himself into the town socially, and had maintained a small apartment in a residential area of Caldwell Junction for some years, before eventually not appearing to live there anymore, though the property records had never changed. He had paid his property taxes every year without fail, through a trust arrangement that Harriet located in county records, and which showed uninterrupted payment from 1961 through the year of Elias's death. So the 2003 interior modification, the reinforced storage room, had been the subject of some local comment at the time, Harriet mentioned, not because it was inherently remarkable, but because the level of construction involved had been unusual for what was, ostensibly, a storage upgrade. The contractor who had done the work was a firm from out of county, not a local business, and they had brought all their own materials and crew and had worked for about 6 weeks. The permit inspection record showed that the inspector had passed the work, but had noted in the margin of the record, in the careful handwriting of a man who recorded things precisely, construction quality significantly exceeds stated purpose. Renata sat with this for a moment. Construction quality significantly exceeds stated purpose, she repeated. Harriet nodded, watching her with calm attention. I noticed that too, she said. Now, what do you think he meant? "I think he meant what he wrote," Harriet said. "He was that kind of man, from what I knew of him. Chet Halverson. Retired now. He wrote down what he observed and didn't editorialize, which meant when he editorialized, you should pay attention. Construction quality significantly exceeds stated purpose. A reinforced room in an industrial building, built to a standard beyond what a storage room required. A newer padlock. No, a letter that said what he left behind was not obvious and would not be found without effort. A $2 million insurance policy on a $1 building. Renata thanked Harriet and walked back to the warehouse in the early afternoon light, and everything she had learned arranged and rearranged itself in her mind as she walked, the way puzzle pieces move on a table when you're not trying to force them, sliding, orienting, or edging toward a configuration that isn't yet visible, but announces itself in the tightening sensation of proximity, the feeling that you are close to something, that the shape is almost there, that if you look from exactly the right angle at exactly the right moment, the whole thing will resolve. She was going to need tools. She was going to need the right tools, and enough time and enough careful attention. She had no money to speak of, but she had the building, and the building, when she was beginning to believe, contained everything else. She walked faster. The warehouse came into view at the end of the road, massive and still, its rust-streaked walls catching the afternoon light in a way that made the weathering look, for a moment, almost like a kind of patina, like something that had been seasoning. When she reached the gate, she could see Mira through the south-facing door she had left propped open, sitting on the concrete floor about 20 feet inside, with her back against one of the metal columns, looking at the west wall. Not at her phone, not at anything small, at the wall, at the shelving unit, at the space behind it where a door was waiting. Renata came through the gate. She crossed the concrete pad. She stepped inside. "Mama," Mira said, not turning. "I've been thinking." "About what?" "About the room behind that door." She paused. "I think there's something important in there. I don't know why I think that. I just do." Renata looked at the west wall. She looked at the shelving unit. She looked at her daughter, who was 7 years old and had walked a dark road to an abandoned warehouse and slept on pallets and eaten crackers for breakfast and had not complained once, not in any way that wasn't simply honest, because she was a child who dealt with the world as it was. "I think so too," Renata said. She sat down on the floor beside her daughter, and both of them looking at the wall, at the padlocked door behind its deliberate concealment, at the beginning of something that neither of them could name yet, but both of them could feel. The particular electricity of a thing not yet revealed, of a secret that was already, in some fundamental way, starting to give way. The keys were in the building. Elias Voss had said so, or rather, his letter had said so. And Renata had decided to take that at face value, not because she was inclined toward faith in vague instructions, but because she was inclined toward efficiency, and the most efficient path forward was to assume the letter meant what it said and proceed accordingly. She spent the rest of that first afternoon doing something that looked, from the outside, like aimless wandering, but was in fact the most systematic search she knew how to conduct. She moved through the warehouse in overlapping grids, but the way she had learned to walk problem sites when she was doing inspection work, not looking for anything in particular, but looking at everything, registering every detail, training her attention on the spaces between obvious things. She checked the underside of every shelf bracket she could reach. She ran her hands along the tops of the metal columns. She lifted the corners of the pallets she had not yet moved. She examined the light fixtures. She opened every drawer in every desk in the office level. She checked the ceiling tiles in the office section, the kind of suspended acoustic tiles that could be pushed up, revealing the void above. She found, in the void above the break room, a layer of fiberglass insulation that had been disturbed at some point, showing a path where someone had reached in and placed something or removed something. She swept aside the insulation carefully, one handful at a time. Nothing was there now, but someone had been there. She came back down. She stood in the center of the main floor. She thought about how a person hides something, not randomly, not carelessly, but in the way of someone who expected the hiding to hold for a specific length of time, who expected it to be found by someone specific, who had thought about how that specific person would search. Elias Voss had chosen her because of qualities observed over years. Practical intelligence, willingness to work, a hardness from loss. He had known something about her. He had made a judgment, and the judgment had been that she would be capable of finding what he had left. She thought about what she knew from the building's history, the 2003 modification, the reinforced storage room. Construction quality significantly exceeds stated purpose. She thought about the insurance policy, $2 million of coverage on a $1 building. Insurance companies didn't write that kind of coverage without knowing what they were insuring. Someone had told them there was something worth insuring. Whatever was in that room was real, was documented somewhere, was worth enough that professional indemnity against its loss had been obtained and maintained. She thought about a man who arrived in Caldwell County in 1959 with enough cash to buy land outright, who listed himself as a commodity broker, who lived simply, who maintained a property for decades, who built a room in 2003 that exceeded its stated purpose, who had no visible family, who had chosen a grandniece he barely knew as the sole heir to whatever this all added up to. She went to the loading dock. She hadn't examined it as carefully as the rest of the building because it was the most visually straightforward section. 3 interior bays, concrete dock platforms, old dock leveler plates bolted in place, by chains and hooks still hanging from overhead rails. She had noted it as clear, moved on. But now she stood in the dock area and looked at it with the specific attention of someone who has learned that what is most obvious is sometimes most disguised by its own obviousness. The dock leveler plates were the kind installed in industrial buildings to bridge the gap between the dock floor and a truck bed. They were heavy, hinged, bolted to the dock edge. Standard. She had seen hundreds of them. But the third one, the one in the rightmost bay, was bolted with bolts that didn't quite match the other 2. The heads were slightly different, the same general type, but made by a different manufacturer, suggesting they had been replaced or added more recently. She knelt on the dock and looked at the bolt pattern. 8 bolts, the same as the others. She ran her thumb over the concrete around the plate and felt what she felt. Smooth, worn, old concrete. She pressed on the plate itself, or it moved. Not much, a centimeter, maybe less, but it moved. A slight give that the other 2 plates didn't have when she pressed them. Not rattling, not loose, just a breath of movement that said there was a void beneath, not the solid concrete substructure she would have expected. She sat back on her heels and breathed. She looked at her multi-tool. She selected the largest flathead component and applied it to the bolts. They were tight, so when she was working with the inadequate leverage of a multi-tool rather than a proper wrench, and it took 40 minutes of sustained effort, trading hands, applying her weight, bracing against the dock edge, before she got the first bolt moving, then the second, then, one by one, the other 6. She set each one aside in a careful row. She lifted the plate. Beneath it was a shallow recess, not much deeper than the thickness of the plate itself, perhaps 3 inches. In the recess were 2 things, a flat steel box, roughly the size and shape of a hardcover book, secured with a simple hinged latch, and a folded sheet of paper. She took the paper first. It was a diagram, hand-drawn, clean, and precise, the work of someone who drew the way engineers drew, with straight lines and careful notation. It showed the floor plan of the warehouse, the main floor from above, with all the major structural elements indicated. And on the west wall, where the door was, there was an annotation in the same careful block print as the letter upstairs, a number, followed by the words, Column 3 West, Base Plate East Face, Magnetic. Renata looked up at the west wall. She looked at the columns along that wall, 6 of them, spaced at 20-foot intervals. She counted from the north end, Column 3 West. She crossed the floor to it. The column base plate was a standard welded steel plate, bolted to the concrete floor, the same as every other column in the building. Except this one had something attached to its east face, attached magnetically, pressed flush against the vertical surface of the plate, in a position that was invisible from the main floor because the column itself blocked the line of sight from any normal walking angle. You had to walk to the column and look around the back of it, or crouch down and look at the base from the north to see it. She crouched. She looked. It was a key. A simple key on a flat magnetic holder, the kind of key holder people put inside their car wheel wells. The key was steel, heavy, machined. Not a standard door key, but a specific, weighty thing with a complex tooth pattern. She took it in her hand and felt the weight of it. Mira appeared beside her. "Did you find it?" she asked. She was barefoot on the concrete, which Renata noted and would address. "I think so," Renata said. "Can we open the door?" "Let's try." She went to the shelving unit first. The unit was bolted at the top to a wall bracket, but the connection was 2 lag bolts into a steel angle bracket. And the steel angle bracket, she now saw, was not welded to the wall, but bolted to it. Bolted from the front, in a configuration that required a socket wrench she didn't have. She looked at this problem for approximately 30 seconds. Then she went to the loading dock, and I retrieved the flat steel box from the recess under the dock plate and opened it. Inside was a socket set, a compact one, in a foam-cut case, 4 drive sizes and 12 sockets, and a ratchet handle. Not new, but well-maintained. Wrapped around the ratchet handle with a rubber band was another small folded note. 3 words. "You'll need these." Renata sat with this for a moment. He had been thorough. He had been more than thorough. He had been anticipatory. She had thought through exactly what someone would need to do and had ensured the tools were present. Not given outright, not obvious, but discoverable. Everything in its place and in its order. A sequence that had to be followed in the right way to unfold correctly. She thought of a man spending the last years of his life setting this up, thinking through each step, imagining the person who would come after him, making sure she had what she needed without making it too simple to be worth anything. The effort is the point. She used the socket set to remove the lag bolts from the wall bracket. The bracket came off clean. The shelving unit, freed from its anchor, rolled forward on its base. It had wheels, casters. She hadn't noticed because they'd been locked. She released the caster locks, and the unit slid smoothly away from the wall on floor that had clearly been kept clean and unobstructed beneath it for exactly this purpose. The door was fully exposed. It was heavier than she had expected, not in appearance but in physical fact. The concrete block wall around it was 12 inches thick, and the door was inset into this thickness with a heavy steel frame, and what appeared to be additional reinforcement on the door itself, the kind of construction detail that belonged on a vault, not a storage room. There was no visible hinge because the hinges were internal. The padlock she had seen before occupied a hasp on the right side, but there was also a second lock point on the left, a keyway, requiring the same key but accessed separately, a 2-point locking system. She used the key. Left side first, then the padlock. Both opened. She pulled on the door. It swung outward on perfectly balanced hinges, silently, with the particular smooth efficiency of something very well made. The air that came out of the space beyond was different from the warehouse air. Cooler, drier, and with a specific climate control quality that meant there was a mechanical system running in there, had been running continuously, maintaining conditions. Renata stood at the threshold and looked in. The room was 30 feet by 30 feet, concrete block walls on 3 sides, and the warehouse wall on the 4th, ceiling at 10 feet with a climate control unit mounted in the upper corner, quietly humming. Industrial shelving covered 3 walls, floor to ceiling. And on those shelves, I am filling them in orderly rows, was what Elias Voss had spent 40 years accumulating. She had not known what to expect. She had allowed herself, quietly and privately, in the back of her mind, where she kept things too vulnerable to examine directly, a version of this moment that involved something concrete and transforming. But she had kept that version small, had not let it grow, had not fed it. And she had learned too many times what the distance was between the thing you hoped for and the thing that was actually there. What was actually there required several seconds to process. The shelves held paintings, stacked in archival storage frames, the kind used in museum collections, vertical dividers, acid-free separators, climate-controlled environment. Not 1 or 2, not a dozen. Rows and rows of them. She stepped inside and walked along the first wall, counting. 14 archival slots on the first shelving unit, 12 on the second, each slot potentially holding multiple works. She stopped at the second unit, and carefully, with hands that she made stay steady, pulled forward one of the storage frames. The canvas it held was an oil painting, approximately 18 by 24 inches, unframed but in excellent condition, depicting a harbor scene. Water? Boats? A particular quality of Northern European light, in a style that she did not immediately recognize, but that carried the unmistakable material quality of age, of history, of work made by hands that had long ago stopped. She set it back carefully. She walked to the second wall. Here the shelving held different objects, wooden crates, carefully marked, stacked in a configuration that made them accessible individually. She opened the nearest crate. Inside, nested in archival tissue, was a piece of carved jade, greenish-white, about the size of a human fist, depicting a figure in a posture of serene attention. She looked at it for a moment. She set it back. She walked to the third wall. This shelving held flat archival cases, the kind used for works on paper, drawings, prints, documents. And beside them, in reinforced cases with combination locks, objects she could see through the clear panels of the cases, but not yet access. Small sculptures, ceramic pieces, on objects made of metal and stone, and material she couldn't identify at distance. There was a row of wooden boxes at the bottom of this section, unlocked, their lids slightly ajar. She lifted the lid of the first one. It held bearer bonds, stacked in paper sleeves, organized by date and denomination. She didn't know the current status of bearer bonds. She knew they had been phased out, and that the ones issued before a certain date had specific legal implications she didn't yet understand. But she knew what they were, knew they represented a claim on money, and the face values she could see on the front documents of the first few sleeves were numbers she had to read twice. She closed the lid. She stood in the center of the room for a long moment. Mira had come in behind her. I had been standing near the door, looking. She was not touching anything. She was looking with the careful, complete attention she brought to things that mattered. "Mama," she said. "Yeah. These are very old things." "Yes." "Are they ours?" Renata took a slow breath. "We're going to find out," she said. We're going to find out exactly what all of this is, and who it belongs to, and what it means. And to do that, we're going to need help." She took out her phone and looked at the signal. 2 bars. Enough. She looked at the room, at its orderly, impossible contents, at the quiet hum of the climate control system, at the 40 years of accumulated and hidden and carefully preserved things that an old man had entrusted to her, a woman he barely knew because he had observed something in her that he decided was worth trusting. She sat down on the floor. Mira came and sat beside her, pressing into her side the way she did when something was large. "Well, are we going to be okay?" Mira asked. Renata put her arm around her daughter. She thought about $43. She thought about the bus ride, the dark road, the rusted gate, the one working light. She thought about a letter that said the effort was the point, that the only education that actually sticks is the one that comes from loss. She thought about everything she had lost and everything she had not, and the particular kind of knowledge that lived only in the space between those 2 things. "I think so," she said. "I really think so." If you stop and think about what Renata Voss was sitting with in that moment, it is almost impossible to hold the full weight of it. She had walked into a room that should not have existed, in a building that had been written off by everyone who had ever looked at it. And she had found inside it something that defied every reasonable expectation she had brought to this place. The question before her now was not whether the room was real. She could feel the climate-controlled air on her skin, could smell the particular combination of old materials and archival preservation that was not a thing you could imagine if you had not encountered it. So I could hear the steady mechanical breathing of the system that had been maintaining this environment through years and decades. The question was what it all meant, what it was worth, whether it was legitimately hers, and how to proceed without making errors that would cost her something she couldn't afford to lose. She was aware, with the specific clarity that comes from having been through things that strip away pretension, that she was not equipped to answer any of these questions alone. She was a woman with a half-finished engineering degree and years of site coordination experience, neither of which had prepared her for a room full of what appeared to be significant works of art, archival documents, decorative objects of unknown provenance, and financial instruments, whose legal status she did not understand. She needed expertise. She needed people who knew things she didn't know, who could look at what she had found and tell her truthfully what it was. She also needed, before she took any of those steps, to understand something about herself. She needed to know whether she was the kind of person who would let the size of what she had found change the fundamental approach she brought to things. Because the approach she brought to things was the only thing that had reliably served her. And it was. Go carefully. Observe completely. Move forward only when you understand what you're moving toward. She was that kind of person, and she had always been that kind of person. This room had not changed that. She got up. She went to the shelving along the first wall and began, systematically, to document what was there, photographing each storage frame and each item visible in it, moving slowly and touching nothing she didn't have to touch. It took the better part of 2 hours to photograph the full room. By the end, she had over 300 photographs organized in a careful folder structure on her phone, or each one labeled with its location in the room and a brief visible description. Then she closed the door. She reset the locks. She moved the shelving unit back into position in front of it, reattached the wall bracket with the socket set she had borrowed from Elias Voss's cache of necessary tools. She replaced the dock plate over the recess, and she put the socket set and the diagram and the magnetic key holder back where she had found them, not out of superstition, but out of the same instinct that kept notes of where things had been, that understood location as information. Then she and Mira walked into town. The decision she made on that walk was a careful one. She had thought, in the first stunned hour after finding the room, not about the various ways a person might respond to discovering what appeared to be a significant fortune in the storage room of an industrial warehouse. Some of those responses were instinctive: excitement, urgency, the desire to tell someone immediately, to have it confirmed by another set of eyes, to make it real by sharing it. She had felt all of those things. And she had also felt the countervailing response that came from years of watching situations go sideways. The understanding that information, once released, could not be recalled, and that the moment she told the wrong person or moved in the wrong direction, she lost control of something she currently held. She needed, specifically, an attorney who practiced in the area of estate and property law, and who was not Gerald Pruitt. Not because Pruitt was necessarily compromised, but because Pruitt had been Elias Voss's attorney and had already represented one side of the transfer she was now on the other side of, and because she needed someone whose only obligation was to her. She also needed someone who knew art. Not a dealer, not yet, but someone with the academic or curatorial background to look at what she had photographed and tell her honestly what she was looking at. And she needed, in a more immediate practical sense, to address the fact that she and her daughter were living in a warehouse on crackers. The gas station attendant from the night before directed her to a hardware store, a diner, and, when she asked about lawyers, to a woman named Sylvia Okafor, no relation to Daniel, as far as Renata could tell, who ran a solo practice out of a storefront on Caldwell Junction's main commercial street, and who was, by the attendant's account, the only attorney within 30 miles who would actually answer her phone. Sylvia Okafor was a woman in her early 60s, with close cropped white hair, reading glasses on a chain around her neck, and the unhurried manner of someone who had learned long ago that hurrying did not actually make things move faster. She listened to Renata without interruption, which was itself unusual enough to be notable, and when Renata finished, she asked 4 questions. Was the property transfer documented and recorded? Had Renata taken possession of any items from the room? Had she spoken to anyone else about what she'd found? Did she have documentation of the original estate proceedings? Renata's answers were yes, no, only her daughter, and yes. Sylvia Okafor looked at her over the reading glasses for a moment. "All right," she said. "Tell me exactly what's in the room, as best you can describe it." So Renata described it. She described the paintings in archival storage, the wooden crates with carved objects, the flat archival cases with works on paper and small sculptures, the wooden boxes with financial instruments. She described the climate control system, the shelving, the construction quality of the room, the 2-point locking system, the 2003 permit. She showed Sylvia the photographs on her phone, unscrolling through them slowly, while the attorney looked at each one with the still attention of someone processing information rather than reacting to it. When they had gone through all 300 photographs, Sylvia Okafor sat back in her chair. "I'm going to tell you something that I want you to hear carefully," she said. "Okay," Renata said. "There is a process for this, and the process matters as much as the contents, possibly more. If what you've shown me is what it appears to be, and I want to be honest that I'm not equipped to evaluate the specific items, then you are sitting at the beginning of a legal and documentary pathway that can take this in several directions, most of which are favorable to you, but only if the pathway is followed correctly. The direction this goes wrong is if anyone with an interest in the outcome gets involved before the documentation is complete and the legal framework is solid." She paused. "Now, do you understand what I mean by that?" "I think so," Renata said. "You mean, if I bring the wrong people in, they bring their lawyers, and suddenly I'm defending something that should be simple." "Yes," Sylvia said. "That's exactly what I mean. What do I do first?" "You let me contact the county about an independent estate assessment. You don't open that room again without a witness, who is either me or someone I've designated. And you find me someone who can speak to these items specifically: provenance, authenticity, approximate value. I know a woman at the State University's Art History Department who consults on exactly these kinds of matters and who knows how to be discreet. Renata looked at her. Why are you helping me? Sylvia Okafor looked back at her steadily. Because you came to me first, before you did anything else. That tells me something about how you think. She picked up a pen. Now, tell me everything about the estate proceedings. Start at the beginning. The art historian's name was Dr. Patricia Wende, and she arrived at the warehouse 3 days later in a car that had seen better years, carrying 2 hard-sided cases and wearing a canvas jacket with too many pockets, and the expression of someone who had learned to maintain a careful professional neutrality in situations where that neutrality was going to be tested. Sylvia was present. Renata was present. Mira was present, and sitting on the dock platform with a book she was pretending to read. Dr. Wende had looked at the photographs Renata had sent through Sylvia, had been silent on the phone for a long time, and had then said she would come. She had not said what she thought she was looking at. She had asked 2 questions. Was the climate control operational, and had anything been moved? Renata had answered yes and no. They opened the room with the same sequence Renata had established. Key left, key right, door out. Dr. Wende stepped inside. She stood in the center of the room for a full minute without moving, looking. Then she put on cotton gloves, opened her cases, removed her equipment, and went to the first shelving wall. She worked for 6 hours. Renata and Sylvia waited in the main warehouse, in chairs Renata had found in one of the upstairs offices and carried down. Mira fell asleep in the afternoon and was sleeping on the pallet bed when Dr. Wende finally emerged from the room and pulled off her gloves and stood in the doorway. She looked at Renata. She looked at Sylvia. She said nothing for a moment. I need to make some calls before I can give you final assessments, she said. I want to check certain catalog records and registry databases, and there are 2 or 3 things I want a second opinion on before I commit to what I think they are. But I can tell you generally what I found. Please, Renata said. Dr. Wende took a breath. The paintings on the first wall, 14 primary works and 11 secondary works, include at minimum 4 pieces that I believe are significant 19th century European works, 2 of which I tentatively identify as Dutch Golden Age, 1 possibly Flemish, and 1 I need more research on, but which shows characteristics consistent with a fairly specific collector tradition. The carved objects in the crates, 17 pieces, appear to be pre-Columbian Mesoamerican, and several of them are of a quality and condition that is frankly remarkable for pieces outside a major institutional collection. The works on paper include what I believe are 3 preparatory drawings that may be associated with documented works in museum collections, and the smaller objects in the locked cases are a mix. Some decorative arts of genuine historical significance, some that are harder to evaluate without full examination. She paused. The financial instruments I can't speak to. That's outside my area. But the art and objects, taken together, represent a collection that, if my preliminary assessments are correct and the provenance holds, would be valued in the range of, she paused again, somewhere between $280 and $310 million. The warehouse was very quiet. Renata was aware of her own breathing. She was aware of Sylvia, beside her, who had the stillness of a person who has trained herself not to react visibly to things. She was aware of Mira, asleep on the pallet, curled under the jackets, her small face completely peaceful. She said, "Is any of it stolen?" Dr. Wendt looked at her with something that was not quite surprise but was adjacent to it. "That," she said carefully, "is the most important question you could have asked. And the answer is that I don't know yet. That's part of what the registry checks are for. There are databases, international, national, that track reported thefts of cultural property. Some of what's in this room, if I'm right about what it is, would have been old enough and documented enough that its disappearance would have been recorded somewhere. Some might not have been. I'll know more in about 48 hours. And if some of it is stolen, Renata asked, then that portion would need to be addressed through the appropriate legal channels, and it would be separated from your inheritance. It would not necessarily affect the rest. She looked at Renata steadily. But your instinct to ask that question first. That was the right instinct. Renata nodded slowly. What's the next step? I make my calls. I run the registry checks. You and your attorney establish the formal documentation chain. And in the meantime, she glanced around the warehouse, at the pallet bed, at the crackers on the dock platform. In the meantime, I'd strongly recommend that you find somewhere more comfortable to wait. Sylvia made a sound that might have been agreement. I have a spare bedroom, she said, if you're willing. Renata looked at Mira. She looked at the room behind its closed and locked door. She looked at the building around her, its sound bones, its rusted shell, its waiting immensity. She thought about the $43 and the key on the plain metal ring and the bus ride through the dark. Thank you, she said. We're willing. The 48 hours that Dr. Wenda had estimated became 72, and then 96, as the registry checks expanded from initial queries into a more thorough cross-referencing process that she explained carefully every time Renata called. It was not, she said, that she had found evidence of theft. It was that the scope of what was in the room required a more comprehensive review than a standard 2-day inquiry. The collection was larger and more significant than even her initial assessment had suggested. She had brought in a colleague who specialized in pre-Columbian material, and the colleague had not said much after viewing the photographs, but had asked to come see the collection in person, which Dr. Wenda had confirmed with Sylvia before proceeding. During those 4 days, Renata stayed in Sylvia Okafor's spare bedroom with Mira, in a house that was warm and had a functional kitchen and a backyard with a rusted swing set that Mira adopted immediately. Sylvia fed them without making anything of it, cooked enough food that there was always something to eat, did not ask questions beyond what was legally relevant. Renata helped around the house without being asked, because she was constitutionally unable to occupy a space without contributing to it, and Sylvia accepted this with the quiet practicality of a woman who found virtue in function. Renata spent her days on her phone, researching. She read about estate law and the specific provisions governing the transfer of personal property through inheritance. She read about the legal status of bearer bonds issued in the decades Elias Voss had been operating. The answer was complicated and jurisdiction-dependent, but the short version was that pre-cutoff bearer bonds could, in certain circumstances, still be redeemed, and the process for doing so was documentable and legal. She read about cultural property law and the international frameworks governing the movement of art and objects across borders. She read about the Art Loss Register and the FBI Art Crime Team and Interpol's Stolen Works of Art database, not because she expected problems, but because she needed to understand the landscape she was operating in. She read about what happened to people who found things and reported them correctly, and she read about what happened to people who didn't. The comparison was instructive. She also called Daniel. It was a conversation she had been turning over for days, deciding whether and how and what to say. She did not tell him about the room. She told him that she and Mira had a stable place to stay for now, that they were okay, that she would need to have a longer conversation with him about Mira's situation when there was more clarity. He sounded relieved in the way of someone who has been carrying guilt and set it down briefly. He asked if she needed anything. She said she'd let him know. On the 4th day, Dr. Wenda called. The registry checks are complete, she said. All 17 pre-Columbian pieces are unregistered. They don't appear in any theft database or export violation record that I can find. Which doesn't mean they have no complicated history, but it means there are no current legal claims against them. Of the paintings, 3 are entirely unattributed in any public record. They appear to have never been publicly exhibited or sold at public auction, which makes their provenance difficult to trace, but also means there's no registered theft claim. The 4th painting, the one I was most uncertain about, does appear in a provenance research database associated with a German museum collection, but not as a stolen item. It appears in a voluntary repatriation review process that the museum has been conducting on their pre-war holdings. That's a different situation, and it will need to be addressed, but it's a legal and negotiated process, not a criminal one. Renata was sitting at Sylvia's kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a notepad. She wrote, "German Museum, voluntary repatriation. It's on legal process," she said. "And the rest?" "The works on paper and the smaller objects. No flags in any registry I have access to. My colleague who came to see the pre-Columbian material spent 3 hours with those pieces and believes 2 of them may have significant export restriction implications under Mexican cultural patrimony law. Again, not theft, but a legal status question that would need to be resolved through appropriate channels. So there are 2 categories of complexity," Renata said. "The German painting and the Mexican export questions. Everything else appears clean." "That's a reasonable summary, yes. What are those resolutions going to look like?" "The German painting. The museum's repatriation review is a good faith process, and if the painting is confirmed as what I think it is, the resolution will likely be a negotiated settlement. Given that your inheritance includes it legitimately, you'd have standing in that negotiation, and the outcomes in similar cases have generally resulted in some form of compensation or co-ownership arrangement." Dr. Wenda paused. "The Mexican pieces are more complicated, and I'd suggest a specialist in international cultural property law." "Sylvia has already made a contact," Renata said. A brief silence. "How long have you been preparing for this conversation?" Dr. Wenda asked. 4 days, Renata said. "I had time." She heard something in the pause that might have been a smile. "Ms. Voss," Dr. Wenda said, "the 2 colleagues I brought in both asked me who you were. I told them what I knew, which is not much. What I told them was that you were the person who found this collection, and that the first question you asked after I gave you a preliminary valuation was whether any of it was stolen." She paused. "They both said the same thing." "What did they say?" "They said, 'Good.' They said that was the right order of operations for a person who intended to keep what they had." Renata looked out Sylvia's kitchen window at Mira on the swing set, pumping her legs, going higher than she probably should have been, her head thrown back, on her face open and unguarded in the way that only happened when she thought no one was watching her. "What is the current preliminary valuation?" Renata asked. "Given what you know now." Another pause. "With the German painting and the 2 Mexican pieces set aside as contested, they're not lost to you, just in process. The uncontested portion of the collection values at approximately $240 million, in my assessment, accounting for the quality of the condition and the strength of the items involved. If the German museum negotiation goes in a reasonable direction, that number rises. The bearer bonds, which I've had a financial attorney colleague look at, on an advisory basis only, and she'll want to speak with you directly, appear to carry a potential redemption value in the range of 40 to 50 million, though that process is lengthy and will require your own specialized counsel. So the total range, uncontested and potential contested together, Renata said, is somewhere around 290 million. Approximately, Dr. Wenda said. Yes, $290 million. 291 if the redemption estimates held. Renata put her pen down. She thought about Gerald Pruitt and his carefully neutral face, and the manila folder, and the assessed value of $1. She thought about the bus, and the dark road, and the rusted gate. She thought about the $43 in the zippered pouch, and the key on the plain metal ring. She thought about Elias Voss, a man she had met twice, who had looked at her from a distance over the years, and had seen something that he decided was worth trusting with everything he had built. The effort is the point. She understood it now, or she understood it better than she had when she first read it. He hadn't been talking about the physical effort of finding the key and removing the bolt plate and locating the socket set. He had been talking about a different kind of effort, the kind that was made not in a warehouse but over years, the kind that looked like loss when it was happening, and only revealed its other meaning afterward. He had been talking about the effort of surviving, of staying practical, sort of refusing to let the hardness that came from losing everything turn into bitterness rather than precision. He had been watching for someone who had done that work and come out the other side still capable of asking the right questions first. She got up and went to the back door and called to Mira, who dragged her feet in the dirt to stop the swing and looked up at her mother. "Come inside for a minute," Renata said. "Yeah, I want to tell you something." Mira came inside and stood in the kitchen doorway, with the alert, open expression she wore when she sensed something mattered. She was still wearing the same jacket she'd had on the night they arrived in Caldwell Junction, though Sylvia had done their laundry twice, and the jacket was clean now. She looked at her mother. "I spoke to the woman who's been looking at the things in the room," Renata said. "She finished her research." "What did she say?" "She said the things in the room are real. They're very old, and they're very valuable, and they belong to us." She paused. "It's going to take a long time to sort all of it out. There are lawyers and processes and things that have to be done in the right order. It's not going to be simple or fast. But at the end of it, we're going to be okay. We're going to be a lot better than okay." Mira looked at her for a long moment. "How much?" she asked. Oh, and then, with the precision of a child who had been listening carefully to adult conversations for 7 years, she added, "Is it enough?" Renata thought about this, about what enough meant, about the specific weight of that word as it applied to their particular life, their particular ledger of losses and necessities. "Yes," she said. "It's enough." Mira nodded slowly. She was processing this as she processed everything, not rushing past it, but letting it settle into the right shape. After a moment, she said, "When can I see it again?" "The room?" "Soon," Renata said. "There are people who need to see it first, officially, and then we'll go together." "Okay," Mira said. She turned back toward the door, back toward the yard, the swing set, the afternoon. Then she stopped. "Mama." "Yeah." "I knew it was going to be something real." "I know you did," Renata said. "I wasn't scared. I mean," she paused. "I was scared, but not of it. I was scared before, of the other things." She looked at the door, not at her mother, in the way children look away from things that are too direct to look at straight. "I'm not as scared anymore." Renata looked at her daughter's back, at the jacket, at the particular posture of a 7-year-old who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and is only beginning to set it down. "Me neither," she said. Outside, the afternoon light was getting long and gold, and the kind of light that makes even the hardest things look like they might be survivable. Mira went back to the swing. Renata stood in the kitchen doorway and watched her go, and thought about all the paperwork that was waiting, all the lawyers and appraisers and process and time, all the careful, slow work of building something real from a beginning that had looked, to everyone who hadn't been paying the right kind of attention, like nothing at all. She went to make coffee. She had calls to return, notes to organize, a list to build. There was a lot of work ahead. She had never been afraid of work. The room waited, locked and climate-controlled, patient as everything old and real is patient, holding what it held in the cool dark until the processes of the world caught up to the fact of its existence. It had been waiting for decades. It could wait a little longer, but not much longer. Because Renata Voss was on the other side of the door now, and she knew what was in there, and she had spent her whole life learning exactly how to open things. The legal process, Sylvia Okafor had warned her, would not be fast. Renata had heard this and believed it, had filed it in the part of her mind where she kept things that required patience rather than action, and had proceeded accordingly. What she had not anticipated, or had anticipated intellectually but not quite emotionally, was how the slowness would feel when measured against the specific gravity of what was waiting to be resolved. She had found something extraordinary, had confirmed it was real, had done the right things in the right order. And now she sat in the deliberate, unhurried machinery of legal process, which moved according to its own necessities, and not hers. The first formal step was an independent estate valuation, conducted by a court-appointed assessor who arrived at the warehouse with 2 assistants and spent 3 days photographing and cataloging and completing forms in triplicate. Renata watched this process from a careful distance, asking questions only when the assessor seemed to welcome them, taking her own notes alongside his. She had already done this work, had her own photographs and her own catalog, but she watched the official version of it with the same attention because official records and personal records were not the same thing, and the differences between them were worth knowing. The assessor's preliminary report, filed 6 weeks after his visit, valued the collection at $263 million, lower than Dr. Wenda's estimate by a meaningful margin, which Sylvia said was normal. So as official assessments in estate proceedings tended to apply conservative methodologies. The report flagged the German painting and the 2 Mexican pre-Columbian pieces as items with pending legal questions and assigned them placeholder values pending resolution. It valued the bearer bonds separately, with a notation about the complexity of the redemption process, at a range of 38 to 52 million. 263 million plus potential bearer bond value, not even conservatively, even accounting for the 2 contested items, even accounting for the taxes that would be owed on an inheritance of this magnitude. And the taxes were going to be significant. Sylvia had been clear about that from the beginning. The number that remained was one that rewrote every calculation Renata had been making about her and Mira's life. She did not allow herself to spend the money before it was real. This was perhaps the hardest discipline she had ever exercised, harder than the physical work of the warehouse search, harder than the patience required by the legal process, harder in some ways than the years that had led to that bus ride. Because the money was real, it existed, it was documented, it was hers. And yet the distance between its existence and her ability to act on it was one that could only be crossed by time and process. And in the meantime, she had to live inside the gap between what was true and what was accessible. Sylvia helped with this in practical terms by arranging a structured legal advance against the estate, a legitimate financial instrument that allowed Renata to access a modest amount while the full proceedings wound through the required channels. It was enough to rent a small apartment in Caldwell Junction, to replace what Mira needed for school, to buy winter coats that fit properly, to eat actual meals at a table. It was not much in the context of what the estate would ultimately yield, but it was enough to begin the process of ordinary life again, which turned out to be its own form of restoration. Mira started school in Caldwell Junction in early October, 6 weeks after they arrived at the warehouse. The school was small, the classes were small, and Mira adapted with the particular resilience of children who have learned that new situations are navigable, that unfamiliar does not mean hostile, that you can find your footing if you pay attention. Her teacher called Renata 3 weeks into the term to say that Mira was one of the most observant students she had worked with in years, that she had a quality of attention unusual in children her age, and to ask whether she had any particular learning needs that the school should know about. Renata said she didn't, that she was just like that she had always been like that. The teacher said she thought that was wonderful. Renata thought she agreed. The German painting took 14 months to resolve. The museum, a mid-sized institution in Hamburg with a legacy collection built partly in the years before the Second World War, had already been conducting the voluntary repatriation review that Dr. Wende had described, and when Sylvia made initial contact through the appropriate legal channels, they were neither surprised nor hostile. They had records indicating that the painting had passed through a series of private hands in the 1950s and early 60s before disappearing from traceable sales records in 1963, which was approximately when Elias Voss would have been establishing himself in Caldwell County. The painting had not been stolen from the museum in the conventional sense. It had never been owned by the museum in the period in question, but it appeared in their provenance review because it had once been owned by a family whose broader collection had been subject to forced sale during the Nazi period, and the museum had been voluntarily tracing and addressing those histories as part of a broader restitution effort. The negotiation was conducted by Sylvia and a specialist in international cultural property law named Edmund Farrar, who came recommended by 3 separate people in Dr. Wende's network, and who charged fees that would have made Renata's eyes water if she had been thinking in the financial terms of 12 months prior. Edmund was precise, methodical, and had a specific gift for finding the exact formulation of an agreement that satisfied everyone's stated principles while also moving forward. After 14 months, the resolution was a formal restitution agreement in which the painting was returned to the surviving heirs of the original family, 2 elderly siblings in Tel Aviv who had been part of the museum's restitution contact list for a decade, along with a documented acknowledgement from the estate and a financial settlement that Renata paid from the estate funds, establishing clean title on the moral dimension of the work's history. The financial settlement was significant, but not ruinous, and Edmund had negotiated it to an amount that the siblings' attorney confirmed was satisfactory. The siblings, when the agreement was finalized, sent a letter to Renata that she read several times. It said that they had not expected this, that they had long since made their peace with never recovering anything from their family's history, and that her willingness to address it correctly rather than to contest or evade had meant something to them that they did not have words sufficient to express. Renata kept the letter in the same folder as Elias Voss's handwritten note. The Mexican pre-Columbian pieces took longer, a specialized legal process involving consultation with Mexico's Secretaría de Cultura and the careful application of international cultural patrimony frameworks that Edmund navigated with the same systematic thoroughness he brought to everything. The resolution, reached 18 months after the initial inquiry, established that 2 of the pieces had documentation trails that predated the relevant Mexican export restriction legislation by enough years to fall outside the statute's coverage, and 1 piece was subject to a negotiated arrangement in which a long-term loan to a Mexican institution was established in exchange for a certificate of clear title. This was, Edmund explained, a favorable outcome, better than the pessimistic scenarios he had outlined at the beginning. Favorable, Renata had said. Good. She had meant it. The bearer bonds required a separate legal process entirely, one involving a financial attorney named Grace Ibeque, who operated out of a large firm in the city and who was not inexpensive but was, according to 3 separate references Sylvia consulted, the right person for instruments of this kind. Grace was direct in a way that Renata appreciated. She did not soften the complexity of the process or minimize the time involved, but she also did not catastrophize, and she had a quality of focused competence that Renata recognized because she had tried to cultivate it in herself. The bonds were pre-cut-off instruments, issued by entities that had since been acquired or reorganized, and the redemption path required working through a succession of institutional histories to establish the current legal holder of the underlying obligation. It was the kind of work that took years and required exact documentation at every step, and Grace did it with the methodical patience of someone who found the puzzle genuinely interesting. The total redemption value, when the process was substantially complete, was $44 million. Lower than the high end of the initial estimate, higher than the low end. Within the range, Renata had learned, by this point, to value outcomes within range as a form of success, because outcomes within range were the result of correct process, and when correct process was the only thing you could actually control. The taxes, when the full accounting was done, were what Sylvia had told her to expect. Significant, not ruinous. Accounted for, addressed, paid. Renata had never in her life been in the position of paying taxes on an amount that large, and she paid them without resentment, which surprised her a little until she thought about it and realized it shouldn't. What the taxes represented was the legitimacy of what she had, the institutional recognition that this was hers, that it had passed through the proper processes and emerged on the other side clean and documented and real. The taxes were a form of proof. She paid them with something that felt, if she was going to be honest about it, close to gratitude. When the final accounting was complete, when the estate was fully settled, the contested items resolved, the bearer bonds redeemed, or the taxes paid, the net amount available to Renata Voss was $173 million. $173 million. She was sitting at a conference table in Sylvia's office when Grace and Edmund and Sylvia all had their final documents in order, and the number was confirmed. Mira was at school. It was a Tuesday in March, 2.5 years after the bus ride, 2.5 years after the gate that shrieked on its hinges, and the key that opened on the third attempt, and the one working light. Renata looked at the confirmed number on the document in front of her. She thought about the woman who had signed her name in Gerald Pruitt's office and walked out into the afternoon with $43 and a 7-year-old. She thought about the years before that, the hospital bills on the kitchen table, the jobs that disappeared, and the apartment that became too expensive, the smaller apartment, the budget motel, the zippered pouch. She thought about her mother, who had died before any of this, who had worked her whole life carefully and modestly, and never had anything like this. She thought about her father, who had drifted into stillness after Celeste died and had never quite come back. She thought about Daniel, who was kind and unlucky, and who had left because he needed something fresh, who was still sending money inconsistently from a city 300 miles away, and who did not know yet what had happened here. She thought about Elias Voss, her father's older brother, a man she had met twice, who had decided that she was the right person, who had built a room to hold what he had spent his life accumulating, who had not known her, but had observed her from a distance and concluded something from that observation that she would never fully understand, because he was dead, and the letter he had left said only what it said, and not more. But she thought she understood the shape of it, if not the details. He had been looking for someone who would do the hard things in the right order, who would ask whether it was stolen before asking how much it was worth, who would find the key before forcing the door, who would pay what was owed before claiming what was theirs. She thought that in some way Elias Voss had been, all his life, to that person himself, a man who had made choices that looked like abandonment, but were, perhaps, the only way he knew how to build something that would outlast him without destroying the people around him. She didn't forgive the abandonment, but she thought she understood its architecture. "Renata," Sylvia said. She was looking at her with the same quiet attention she had offered since the first day. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Renata said. "I'm thinking. Take your time." She thought about what she was going to do, not the specific financial decisions. Those had been discussed and planned and were already in process. A structure of trusts and accounts and advisors that Grace and Sylvia had helped design, built to protect and preserve and grow what Renata now held. She knew what she was going to do with the money in the practical sense. What she was thinking about now was something else. She was thinking about what she was going to do with the warehouse. She had not sold it. She had been advised that she could, had considered the option, had decided against it. The building was hers. She had inspected its bones in the early morning light of her first full day, and concluded that they were good, that neglect and ruin were different things, that what looked worthless from the outside might be the most solid thing standing if you knew how to look. She had been right. The building had been the container for everything that followed, the place where the secret was kept, the place where the work began, the place where she had understood what effort actually meant. She was going to fix the roof. She was going to repair the windows and address the water infiltration and deal with the structural issues she had cataloged that first morning. She was going to restore the building properly, which meant doing it the way her half-finished engineering degree and her years of site work and her specific knowledge of what good construction looked like would guide her. And then she was going to do something with it that she had been thinking about for months, quietly in the back of her mind, where she kept the ideas that were too large to examine too directly until they were ready. She was going to turn it into a space for people who were trying to build something from nothing. Workshops, for studios, education programs, a small incubator for trades education. The specific shape of it was not fully formed yet, but the intention was clear. A place that understood what it meant to start with what looked like nothing and discover it was actually the beginning of something. She was going to call it, she thought, and this was the idea she had been carrying longest, had told no one yet. She was going to call it the Elias Voss Center, not because the man had been admirable in every way, and not because she had any romantic notion of what he was, but because the name was honest, and honesty was the only foundation that held. She was going to finish her degree. She had looked into this already, had spoken to an advisor at the State University where Dr. Wende taught, had learned that her credits from 19 years ago were partially transferable, and that a degree completion program existed for exactly her situation. And she was 39 years old, and she was going to finish what she had started, not because she needed the credential, but because she had wanted it before she was forced to stop, and want that was interrupted by necessity rather than choice did not simply disappear. It waited. She had learned that things that were real waited. She was going to buy a house, not a large one, not an impressive one, just a house with a kitchen that worked, and a yard and a room for Mira that was only Mira's. She had been looking at houses in the area around Caldwell Junction, which had not much to offer in terms of options, but had a few, solid, modest, real. She knew which one she wanted. She had walked past it twice. She was also going to call her father. This was the item on her internal list that she had been carrying the longest and approaching most indirectly, circling it the way you circle something you need to face but aren't quite ready for. Thomas Voss was 71 and lived in the same house in Faro Hill where Renata had grown up, and they spoke infrequently, not out of hostility, but out of the particular distance that had grown between them in the years after her mother died, when he had withdrawn into stillness and she had been too busy surviving to sit with him in it. She had not told him about the warehouse. She had not told him about the inheritance, about the collection, about any of it. She had needed to understand it herself before she could explain it to someone else. And she had also needed, though she would not have put it this way at the time, to do it herself first. To have done it before she told him. So that the story she told was a completed one, or close enough to complete it. There was also the matter of Elias Voss. Thomas and Elias had been brothers, and the estrangement between them was one of those family silences Renata had learned not to press on. One of those things that lived in the spaces between sentences, in the way her father's face changed when the name came up, in the careful neutral tone that meant the opposite of neutral. She did not know the full story. She thought she might never know it fully. But the fact remained that his brother had watched Thomas's family for years from a distance, and had made a specific judgment about Thomas's daughter, had chosen her, had left her everything. That was a strange and complicated gift to explain to a man who had reasons she didn't fully understand for keeping his brother at arm's length. It was going to be a long conversation. She was going to have it. The house she wanted was on a street called Linfield Road, about 2 miles from the warehouse, not a 2-story wood frame with a covered front porch, and a backyard that had gone to wild grass and could be made into something. A kitchen that faced the morning light. 3 bedrooms, including one that was small, but had a window overlooking the yard, which was the room for Mira. It had been empty for 2 years. The price was modest in absolute terms, and, given what Renata now had, almost notional. She put in an offer the week after the final accounting was confirmed. It was accepted by return email within 4 hours because it was a fair offer on a house nobody else was looking at, in a town that the rest of the world had stopped paying attention to. She told Mira about the house that evening, at Sylvia's kitchen table over dinner. Mira asked 3 questions. Did it have a yard? Did it have a room that was hers? And could they get a dog? The answers were yes, and that they could talk about it. Mira said that meant yes. She was not wrong. I'm ready, she said. Sylvia picked up her pen. Grace opened the document folder. Edmund checked his notes. They moved through the final paperwork with the practiced efficiency of 3 professionals who were very good at what they did. And Renata signed her name where indicated and initialed where indicated, and asked 3 questions she had prepared and received 3 clear answers. When it was done, Sylvia passed the last document across the table. That's it, she said. And Renata looked at the document. She thought about Gerald Pruitt's manila folder and the assessed value of $1. Thank you, she said. She looked at each of them. All of you. I know what this took. Grace said something modest and professional. Edmund said something similar. Sylvia said nothing, just nodded in the way of someone for whom the work itself had been sufficient acknowledgement. Renata picked up her bag and walked out of the office into the March afternoon. It was cold, the particular cold of late winter that carries in it the faint rumor of something warmer coming. She walked the 6 blocks to Mira's school and stood outside on the sidewalk and waited. When the school doors opened and the children came out in the loose, jostling way of afternoon release, she watched for her daughter. Mira emerged in the middle of a cluster of 3 other girls, talking with a focused animation that Renata recognized as the expression her daughter wore when she was in the middle of explaining something, working out the logic of something aloud, making a case for something she believed. Her teacher had been right. She was like that. She had always been like that. Mira looked up and saw her mother waiting, which was not usual. Renata generally arrived a few minutes after the doors opened and met her at the corner. So today she was early and she was right at the gate, and Mira registered this without making it strange, just walked toward her with the same focused expression, finishing whatever she had been saying to the other girls, then shifting her attention to Renata. "You're early," she said. "I finished up faster than expected." Mira looked at her face for a moment, with that specific reading quality she had. "It's done?" she said. "It's done." Mira was quiet for a moment, absorbing this. Then she said, "Can we go see the warehouse?" "Yes," Renata said. "That's exactly where I was thinking of going." They walked together, the way they had always walked, Mira's hand in hers, as long as Mira wanted to hold it, and then swinging freely when she didn't, talking about school and about what Mira had been explaining to the other girls, which turned out to be a theory she had developed about the structural properties of certain kinds of bridges. No, a theory that Renata confirmed was largely correct, and which she had arrived at by looking carefully at pictures and thinking carefully about what she saw. They passed the gas station and the closed diner, and the intersection where the bus had dropped them off 2.5 years ago in the dark. They turned down the road that transitioned from pavement to cracked concrete. The warehouse came into view. The rust on the walls caught the afternoon light the same way it always had. The chain-link fence, the gate, the concrete pad, the south door. All of it the same as it had been on the first night, and all of it completely different. Renata opened the gate. It shrieked on its hinges. She had replaced the padlock months ago but had not replaced the hinges yet, because the hinges were on the list of things to address in the restoration. And the restoration had a sequence, and this was not yet its moment. It would be. They went inside. The warehouse in afternoon light was the warehouse she knew now, not the vast, dark, uncertain thing it had been that first night. She knew its measurements, and its problems, and its specific sounds. The way the wind moved through the broken upper windows, and the way the metal walls expanded in warm weather and contracted in cold. The language of an industrial building in a specific climate, learned through presence and attention. And she had spent more time here in the past 2.5 years than anywhere else, coming nearly every day after Sylvia's, overseeing the initial safety work she had been able to fund from the legal advance, doing some of it herself. The broken windows were temporarily boarded. The roof repairs were underway. A roofing contractor from out of county she had vetted carefully. The plumbing had been properly assessed, and a plan for full rehabilitation was drawn and permitted. It was in progress. It was going to take another year to do it right. That was fine. She had learned how to wait for the right things. They walked to the west wall. The shelving unit was back in its position. The room behind it was locked and currently being monitored by a security service she had arranged through Sylvia. Discreet, but real. The collection had been professionally documented and insured, and was in the care of the appropriate institutions now, properly transferred and receipted. Now, the collection items that had been sold already sold through a reputable auction house that Edmund's network had identified. The ones she had kept, and she had kept a few, for reasons she didn't fully articulate even to herself, the reasoning more felt than logical, were being stored in a proper facility until the warehouse was ready to house them as she intended. Mira stood in front of the shelving unit and looked at it, the same way she had stood looking at it that first morning. Do you remember what you said?" Renata asked her. "That first day, when you were sitting here, and I came back from the library?" Mira thought about it. "I said I thought there was something important in there. You said you didn't know why you thought that. You just did." Mira nodded slowly. "What do you think now?" Renata asked. "About why you knew?" Mira was quiet for a moment, looking at the wall, at the familiar ordinary face of the shelving unit that had covered something extraordinary. "I think," she said carefully, "that the building felt different from other places, like it had been kept carefully, like someone was taking care of it, even though it didn't look like it." She paused. "I think I felt that." Renata looked at her daughter. She thought about what Elias Voss had said about the only education that actually sticks, about loss, about hardness, and what it could become. She thought about what it meant to raise a child in difficulty and have the child come out of it with that capacity, to feel the care inside the neglect, to look at something that seemed abandoned and understand that it had been kept. That wasn't nothing. That was, in fact, almost everything. "You were right," Renata said. It had been kept very carefully. Mira turned and looked at her mother. "What are we going to do with it?" she asked. "The building, I mean. Not the things inside. But the building. I want to turn it into a place where people can learn to build things, Renata said. A center, workshops and classes, and a space for people who want to learn trades. People who are starting with not very much and need somewhere to come. Mira considered this. Like us, she said. Before. Like us before, Renata agreed. And like a lot of other people. What are you going to call it? Renata looked at the wall, at the old rust-stained concrete block, at the afternoon light coming in from the upper windows, at the space they were standing in that had been written off as worthless by everyone who hadn't looked closely enough. The Elias Voss Center, she said. Mira thought about this for a moment. After your uncle? Yes. Even though you didn't really know him? Maybe because of that, Renata said. I think there's something right about putting his name on something that does what he wanted the building to do. He kept it. He built it to last. He chose the person he gave it to because he thought that person would use it well. She looked at the wall. I'm going to try to be worth that. Mira looked at her mother with the clear-eyed directness she had always had. You are, she said. Simply the way she said things that she was certain of. Not as reassurance, but as fact. Renata felt something move in her chest, something that had been very still for a very long time. She thought about everything the warehouse had been and everything it was going to become. She thought about the way things that have been kept carefully do not announce themselves. They wait, they hold, they reveal themselves only to the people who do the work of really looking. She thought about what her half-life of structural education had taught her, that the most important thing about a building was what was invisible, what was underground, what you couldn't see from the street. The foundation, the bones, what held. Her bones had held. Mira's hand found hers, the way it did without asking, and they stood together in the warehouse that had been worth $1 and the warehouse that had been worth everything, because it turned out both of those things were true at once and always had been, and the only difference was the attention you were willing to bring to it. Outside, the March afternoon was moving toward evening. The light through the upper windows was going golden, then amber, the way light went at the end of the day when it was working its hardest. Mira leaned into her mother's side. Can we come back tomorrow? She asked. We'll come back every day, Renata said. We have a lot of work to do. She meant the building. She meant the foundation. She meant the roof and the windows and the permits and the plans. Or she meant the degree she was going to finish and the center she was going to build and the small house with the yard and the room that was only Mira's. She meant all of it. The long work of what came next. The work that was not dramatic because it happened day by day, decision by decision. Showing up when you were tired, and showing up when you were uncertain, and showing up even when the thing you were building was not yet visible, was still underground, like was still the bones of something that had not yet declared its shape. She had been doing that work for years without knowing it had a destination. Now she knew. She called her father that evening after Mira was in bed. She sat in the kitchen of the house on Linfield Road. They had moved in 3 weeks after the offer was accepted, which turned out to be the fastest timeline she had ever experienced in any property transaction, and a speed she attributed to cash offers and a motivated seller. And she called Thomas Voss at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, which was when he was reliably awake and not yet asleep, because his schedule had not changed in the 30 years she had known it. He answered on the second ring. She told him, methodically, and without dramatizing any of it, what had happened over the past 2.5 years. The letter from Gerald Pruitt, the bus ride, the warehouse, the room, Dr. Wenda, the number, the process, where she was now. She told it in the order it had happened, because that was the only order that made it comprehensible, and she watched the clock while she talked, Not because she was impatient, but because she knew her father processed information at his own pace, and she wanted to leave him time to do that. When she finished, there was a silence on the phone that lasted long enough to mean something. "Elias," her father said. "Yes." Another silence. She waited. "Inini watched you," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. "Over the years. He told me once, years ago, before things between us were done. He told me he thought you had something. He said it the way he said things, like he was making a note of a fact. I didn't think much of it then. I thought it was just something he said." "Why were things between you done?" Renata asked. She had never asked this before. She asked it now, not because the warehouse or the money had changed what she needed to know, but because she was 39 years old and done with the kind of patience that was actually avoidance. Her father was quiet for a longer time. Then he said, "He left. When things were hard for your grandmother, not hard the way things got later, but the first hard time, he made a choice to take care of himself instead of staying to take care of her. I thought it was a choice you didn't make when you were family. And he thought I was wrong to judge him for surviving when the alternative was being consumed." Another pause. "We were both probably right in ways neither of us could see clearly at the time. He kept watching us," Renata said. "All those years." "Yes," Thomas said. "He would have seen that as doing something. Different from what I thought he should do. But something." She thought about this. About two brothers who had arrived at different philosophies of what it meant to honor the people you came from, and had never fully reconciled the gap between those philosophies, and had each, in their different ways, continued to keep their eye on the family they had not stayed in contact with. "He chose me," she said. "Not you, not anyone else." "He chose you," Thomas said, "because you were what you were. And maybe because," he stopped. She waited. "Because he thought you would know what to do with it. And you did." The conversation went on for another hour, the longest she and her father had spoken in years, maybe in her adult life. They talked about Celeste. They talked about Faro Hill and what it had become. They talked about Mira, whom Thomas had not seen in 2 years, and whom Renata told him needed to know her grandfather better. And Thomas made a sound that was not quite agreement, but was close enough. When they finally hung up, Renata sat in the kitchen of her own house on Linfield Road for a long time, in the specific quiet of a house that was hers, feeling the weight of the conversation settle. Some things took a long time to become what they were. That was not a flaw in the process. That was the process. She turned off the one working light she kept on at the far end, the same one, still working, 2.5 years later, and walked with her daughter out through the south door, out across the concrete pad, through the gate that shrieked on its hinges. She pulled the gate closed behind her. She locked it. She and Mira walked down the road toward home, their shadows long in the last of the afternoon light, and the warehouse stood behind them in the winter air, solid and waiting and, finally, known. 2 months later, Thomas Voss came to visit. He stayed for a week. He met Mira properly for the first time as the person she had become, rather than the small child he remembered. And Mira, who had heard stories and formed a careful initial opinion based on them, took 3 days to warm to him, and then spent the remaining 4 days showing him the warehouse with the proprietary authority of a 9-year-old who understood the building as intimately as anyone. Thomas walked the main floor slowly and said very little, which was his way. But Renata watched his face and saw in it something she had not seen in many years. The particular stillness that was not absence, but attention, on the expression of a man who was taking something in rather than holding something out. On his last morning, before the drive back, he stood with Renata at the gate and looked at the building. "Your grandmother would have understood this," he said. "Not the money. She would have been baffled by the money, but the rest of it, coming to a place that everyone had given up on and seeing that it was still good. She knew how to do that. Renata looked at the warehouse. She thought about her grandmother, a woman she had known only in childhood, who had survived things that were never fully talked about, and had raised 2 sons in a world that did not make it easy. "I think I got it from her," she said. Thomas looked at her. "I think you did," he said. "If this story moved you, if you thought about the things we tell ourselves are worthless because we haven't looked at them closely enough, or the people we underestimate because their hardness comes from a place we don't understand, then take a moment before you scroll on. Think about what it means to keep something carefully for the right person, and about what it means to be the kind of person someone else trusted with their life's work. There are warehouses in all of our lives, things that have been written off at $1 that contain something that was always waiting for the right attention. If that idea landed somewhere in you, share this video. Someone you know might need to hear it. And if you're watching on a channel you found valuable, now is a good time to subscribe, because we have more stories like this one. Stories about the people who show up in the right moment and do the hard thing in the right order and come out the other side holding something real. We'll see you in the next one.